Welcome to the Cut for Time podcast here at the Canton United Methodist Church. My name is Pastor Clay. I'm joined by Eric Stearns, and today we're digging into my message from Sunday, which was all about our call to go and how we are called to go, but yet we do not go alone because Paul had Barnabas, and we have people that speak into our lives as well. So let's get into it.
So Barnabas and Paul.
Yes.
What's the backstory with those two?
Yeah. So Barnabas, we actually know very little about because he just kind of shows up in the book of Acts.
That's what I was going to say.
Yeah. Obviously, he is a Jewish convert to Christianity. He is one that the disciples through their work and ministry have reached. Barnabas is obviously one who has given his life to Jesus and is following what's at that point in time called the way. There was no church. There was just the way. You're following the way of Jesus, and that was still in the days where this new thing called Christianity was not seen as its own religion, but as a sect of Judaism that believed in a Messiah, or that believed that the Messiah had come. And so he obviously had some kind of relationship with the disciples, and then eventually some kind of relationship with Paul as well, that kind of helped Paul figure out who he was now, because his world has just been rocked. He is struck to the ground. Like, this very proud man is struck to the ground. Life is radically different. And he's still trying to figure out exactly what that means. And that's why those years in the wilderness were so important, and possibly how, we don't really know how Paul and Barnabas met either. But yet it was Barnabas was the voice of reason. When it came time for Paul to meet the disciples, is Barnabas that goes with Paul to Jerusalem to introduce himself to the disciples for the first time. And it is Barnabas who comes to Paul's back to have his back when the disciples are not so sure about Paul. The disciples react the exact same way to Paul as did Ananias, where they know who he is. They know his reputation. They know what he's about and what he's done and the way that he interacted with those who have started to follow Jesus, and they're skeptical. And I get it, but also this is just further proof of the transformative nature of who Jesus is. That he took Saul from where he was and turned him into Paul, where he was at that moment where he finally met with the disciples. And it's Barnabas that tells the story of what happened on the road to Damascus. It's Barnabas who tells the story of what happened in Arabia in the wilderness. It's Barnabas who makes it okay for for Paul to exist in this circle that he'd eventually, become an integral part of. And so that's kind of really the relationship as we know it as we came to Scripture on Sunday. Paul's relationship with Barnabas grows more as Paul refines his call. Because at this point, Paul still does not know that God has set him apart to be one of the ones to take the gospel to the Gentiles. But Paul is in this season of going to synagogues and proclaiming. I mean, because he was a member of the Sanhedrin, because of his previous life, he has the right to speak in the synagogue. And so he just goes and he proclaims Jesus, and it makes people angry to the point where they're trying to kill him because he at that point would be seen as a blood traitor. To follow Jesus and not be Jewish that would be a big deal. And so Barnabas watches all of this happen, and eventually in Acts chapter 13, Paul and Barnabas are commissioned to go. They are commissioned to go on what's now Paul's first missionary journey. And Barnabas is one of Paul's travel partners in that. He is a co-conspirator in the gospel for Paul's ministry. They go, through what's kind of modern day Turkey, and they kind of make this big loop, and then they go back, and after that, the relationship is such that they're just two workers for the gospel. They're just two brothers in faith that have been through so much together, because there was trouble everywhere Paul and Barnabas went on that first missionary journey, because the Jewish folk in those places could not handle the message that Paul was proclaiming, could not wrap their head around how Saul became Paul and became the one that was coming to the synagogue to proclaim Jesus and to debate those that would debate him. And because he is a very intelligent person, schooled in how to debate people, he was pretty persuasive. So he had a lot of success along the way with some Jewish believers and as well as non-Jewish people already. And then also he made a lot of Jewish people very angry. And so they go through, death threats, and they go through, people trying to kill him. At the end of the first missionary journey, Paul is stoned and left for dead. But he's not dead, obviously, because there's, 3 more missionary journeys he has to go on. But, Barnabas is the one that's by his side the entire time. And the reason why the relationship breaks up, at the end of chapter 14, Paul and Barnabas are getting ready for the second missionary journey. They were getting ready to go out again. Barnabas wants to bring along a guy that was marked named John. It was kind of one of those interesting names in the book of Acts, and Paul does not want him to go. And so they go their separate ways. And they depart from one another in peace. They bless each other as they go, but they can see that they're going in different directions, and that's okay. Because the directions that they're going are to live faithfully into the call that God's placed on their lives. And so Paul goes on the second missionary journey with Silas, and Barnabas continues to do what he does in representing Christ to the world, because he is one who is called and sent to go and be about that work.
How long were these missionary journeys? How long would these missionary journeys take?
Yeah.
I mean, are we talking years, I would assume? One
of them, yes, because it is on one of the missionary journeys that Paul lives in Corinth for 18 months and lives in Ephesus for 2 years. So the missionary journeys, and just because travel took that kind of time, we're talking, I can't remember the exact dates of the first one, but we're talking months and years, not weeks and days. But again, it goes back to Paul being a Roman citizen, that he's able to travel and would travel with his posse, travel in safety, and with that protection of being a Roman citizen, going to the Roman world with the message of Christ.
How would they have financed these trips?
Acts chapter 2, the church, the early church, holds all things in common, and so it would have been, he would have been financed by other like-minded people. As well as having, his own personal wealth would have been kind of the main sources of funding.
Sure.
So
okay, things I've always been curious about.
Yeah, definitely. And especially when he lived in Ephesus and Corinth, Paul worked. He was also a tent maker by trade, and so he worked in those places, and even in Ephesus, admonished people that did not work for their wage. And so he's I could have come, there were certain allowances later that would have allowed him to just receive support from the church in that place. And he said, no, that's not how I'm going to do things. I'm going to work, because that's, again, part of, he has the talents and skills to do that. And that's who he is. He's going to be the one to work.
Well, like we've talked about, God calls us to use our talents and skills for his glory, and so that's what Paul's doing.
Absolutely.
So when they would go on these, just it's curiosity almost. When they would go on these missionary journeys, was it likely just the 2 of them, or is it probably a group of them?
There was usually a group of them. There are other names listed in the scriptures, especially on the second missionary journey when they meet Timothy. So it's Paul and Silas and Timothy, and then the others as well. And so that would be just as true on the first missionary journey as well. Paul and Barnabas were the ones that were commissioned to go. But that would have, that wasn't just 2 guys in a boat or two guys walking down the road. They would have had people with them as well.
Wow.
To travel. They're already under the blanket of traveling safely as Roman citizens, but also as Paul being a Roman citizen, but just, for additional security, you just don't travel alone.
Sure.
The early mission of the church is something that just fascinates me. So
yeah, that's why I keep asking questions. It's insane when you think about what we can do now with technology.
Right.
What they were able to do by foot and word of mouth to get this to spread like it did at that time.
Yep. and then eventually by letters. I mean,
Right.
that wouldn't even be the top 5 thing I would choose to do
Right.
to get the word out about something now.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Well, and the fact that Christianity spread like it did, preaching to a group of people who didn't want to hear it.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I can't. It's hard to fathom that.
Yeah.
To wrap your brain around how Christianity ever got started.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
No one was born into it like Judaism.
Like I said earlier, like it was seen as a sect of Judaism. It wasn't seen as a separate thing until a little bit later.
Mm-hmm.
When it became absolutely apparent that this is something that's not Judaism. This is something
Right.
that's very, very different, and they're
Mm-hmm.
called to live differently because of the sacrifice of Jesus Christ.
Right.
It's like what Paul says to the Galatians: "You've been given freedom. Do not submit to a yoke of slavery again, and that freedom comes in Christ."
Mm-hmm.
And so that's how they are called to live. There was eventually a break where Christianity became its own thing and Judaism remained its own thing.
Mm-hmm.
Paul was just the right person at the right time. Not coincidentally.
Mm-hmm.
He was the right person because of his background and because of what he was able to tell people about his life, at the right time where he could go where others couldn't.
Mm-hmm. Well, and how do you not listen to a man like Paul?
Mm-hmm.
To have such a transformation that he had,
Yep.
it's hard it's hard to ignore him.
Yes.
Yeah.
One of my professors in seminary put it, I liked how he said this because I kind of have always felt the same way. Like, I have felt like my testimony didn't have as much power because, like, I was born and then I was adopted, and then, like, my welcome home party was in the church, and I was raised in the church since then. And when someone said, "Do you want to become a Christian?" I said, "Absolutely," and prayed. Like, that's there was no, there was no light from heaven and voice of God. There was just a life of faith that was lived, and like there are other people that have a much more compelling story, like Paul,
Right.
and what Dr. Strickland said at seminary was that there are some people that pass over to faith at a narrow part of the stream. It doesn't mean that their story is any less valid. It just means that, there wasn't a wide chasm to cross.
Mm-hmm.
It was just a smaller part of the stream.
Mm-hmm.
I liked that a lot when I heard it.
Yep. So I was the same way. I grew up in this building.
Mm-hmm.
And so my path to being a Christian was easy.
Yeah.
In comparison to so many people.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think God has a reason? It's obviously all a part of the plan
Right.
for us.
Yep.
So where does our big step come? Other people's big step is just becoming a Christian because they grew up in a very different situation.
Mm-hmm.
Do you wonder
Yeah,
about
definitely.
You became a pastor. That's a big step.
Well, yeah.
Where's my big step? I don't know.
But I think that like remaining faithful can be hard.
Mm-hmm.
Even as a pastor, like remaining faithful is your big step.
Yeah.
And it's not so much what God pulled you out of, it's what God, it's the gutter that God prevented you from in the first place. So one of the things that I mentioned on Sunday was, then very, very briefly, at the end of the sermon, is that Paul would not be who he was without Barnabas. Like Paul needed Barnabas in those moments because the disciples were ready to just reject him. And I just don't know how Paul would have responded to that on his own. Like we talked about last week in the podcast, like Paul could have received his sight after after Ananias touched him and then just turned around and said, "I got these papers and you're coming with me." And he didn't. If the disciples would have rejected him, what would that have looked like? If there wasn't a Barnabas to go to bat for Paul, who is essentially a baby Christian at this point, what would that have done? So Paul would not have been Paul without Barnabas. And like I know for me, I would not be who I am without a lot of people. And that's true for every single person. Like there is always someone who's come alongside to make some kind of a difference in our lives. It can be a teacher or a coach or a pastor or whomever, but like there are people in my life that have been a Barnabas to me. There are people that have just believed in me when maybe I didn't. You know what I'm saying? Like I think of my best friend from seminary, his name is Chad, and like I did not think I fit in at the seminary because even though I was a theology and philosophy major in college, and like it was kind of the same thing in the same in the same context. Like this is grad school, this is way different. But I had Chad. Like we became pretty fast friends, and we had kind of some very similar backgrounds. We really just hit it off on a lot of things. He is one that made me feel okay being at the seminary. Like he made me feel like I could do this, and remains one of my dearest friends to this day. I would not be the preacher I am without Chad, because he was in two of the four preaching classes I took in seminary with me, and he was one that helped me develop who I am as a preacher. And that's just inescapable for me, that I would not be who I am without Chad. So, Eric, I would just be curious to know, as you think about your own life and your own life of faith, who would be those people that Eric would not be Eric without XYZ person? Who would you say?
There's been a lot. To pinpoint one or two is tough because, I can think of a couple of teachers who were big.
Yeah.
When I was in high school, there's an engineering program in Canton.
Nice.
And I was a part of the first class to actually start taking those classes. At that time, I thought I wanted to be a chemistry teacher. My chemistry teacher was also my engineering teacher, and he was the one who encouraged me to go into engineering. So he was the one who kind of steered me in that direction.
Yeah.
So he was influential there. But throughout my life, my dad has always, so he and I do not share feelings. That's just our relationship.
Fair.
We leave feelings out of it.
That's all right.
But if I ever needed support, I always knew he would be there. We don't ever have to say anything to each other, but he's always there.
Yeah.
He was always at every game, whether that was, it didn't matter. Every game, every concert, every whatever.
Nice.
He was there. Every FFA event, he was always there. I've always admired how he carries himself. He's a very humble guy. You know him very well.
Yeah.
But he's a very humble guy. Never going to brag about anything. Just goes about his work and, does his thing. And I admire that, and I kind of try to model my life on how my dad has kind of done things.
Yeah.
And we were not forced to go to college, but we were also told, you guys are too smart to not go to college, And so they allowed us to make our own decisions on what we wanted to do with our lives.
Yep.
Essentially, they said you either need to you need to do something after high school. He went to 1 year of college and became a farmer and has been very successful at farming.
Yeah, sure.
But they also saw the value in getting educated. And obviously, you don't need to have a college education to become a farmer.
Yep.
But they saw a value in getting education after high school. And so they encouraged us to do that. And it was obviously huge for me and huge for my brothers. And
Yeah.
I don't know. There's just been so many times where if I need advice, if I need whatever I need or help on stuff, the last 2 weeks cleaning up my basement and pouring concrete and all that
Yeah,
stuff, Dad was
definitely.
there all the time,
Nice.
helping me with whatever I needed. And so my dad has been one that has always, has helped me become the person I am.
Yeah.
The other person actually would be my wife. She and I started dating when I was 15. So essentially I was a baby when we started dating. And so those big years where you're trying to form who you are as a person, she's always been there. She's the one that I share the very few emotions that I share with people, she is the one I share those things with.
Yeah.
She knocks me down a couple pegs when I get too high on myself, but she also is very good at picking me up when I'm feeling like I'm not being a good father or whatever struggles I'm going through.
Yeah.
She's always there to help me through those things.
Awesome.
You know, but we went to high school together. We went through college together. We got married when we were seniors in college, right before our senior year, and so we were able to. I mean, your senior year of college is a big year,
Oh yeah,
and
definitely.
so to have her there through that whole thing as my wife, which is way different than as my girlfriend.
Yes.
I don't know. That was big too, and so those two people really stick out to me as people that have helped me become me.
Nice.
Yeah.
But there's a flip side to the conversation too, is that we have the opportunity to be a Barnabas to somebody, to really to lift people up and raise people up, to have that pivotal role in the lives of people. And like maybe it's just different for me because I'm a pastor, but like as I think about that part of the question, I'm currently serving as a candidacy mentor for a young man named Tyler Kopp. He's awesome and doing some really good things in ministry and starting seminary and just rolling along in his candidacy stuff. But I really am thankful for the role that I've been able to play in his life. And then there's also a young man from Beersford named Alex Jensen, who I had him as a camper for 3-4 years, and he is heading towards ministry as well.
That's cool.
So I've been able to have that with a couple of different people, and that's been incredibly humbling to serve that role in people's lives. Is just to my perception at least, is that's what I'm hoping I'm doing, is helping them along the way, and so that's just kind of been a real cool thing to be a part of.
Do you also feel like when you help someone through whatever they're dealing with, whatever the problem might be, it also strengthens the way you make decisions? Do you feel that way?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Because along those same lines, I try to really help because, we hire quite a few new people every single year, and not because we're a bad place to work and everyone leaves. No, we're
Right.
just
Yeah.
growing
You're
that much,
yeah.
and we continue to expand it, so we're always hiring new engineers. And I always try to be available to help them through because there is a very steep learning curve from finishing engineering school to actually being an engineer.
Yes.
It's a whole different world.
Absolutely.
So don't think when you graduate engineering school that you're an engineer, because I quickly learned that I was wrong. There was a lot of guys at work that helped me through a lot of stuff, and so I now, since I've been there for 7 years, I try to be as available as possible to those new engineers when they come in and help them problem solve, or even just like find where the pens are.
Right.
Definitely.
Definitely.
It's something as easy as that. But
Yep.
like when they run into something that I think is easy, I need to remind myself that at one point I was there too.
Yep.
But when I'm helping them through an engineering problem, like me just helping them through those things helps me realize that, okay, what I'm doing is right. As I teach that person how to do it,
Right.
it
Yep.
strengthens what I know.
Yeah, totally. One of my seminary professors has crossed over to the dark side of ministry. He still teaches, not at the seminary level, but he's now also a pastor. And like there are just some nuts and bolts things that you cannot get in a classroom that you only get by doing ministry. Like you can talk about them in seminary in theory, but until you're in the trenches, you have no clue what you're doing in certain areas. And so because we have this pre-formed relationship, I am one that he has reached out to a number of times about just, hey, what are the functions of how I do XYZ? Where are the pens, basically? It's never in the spirit of, that's a bad idea. It's always in the spirit of, what's the rationale? What's the reason? And having some of those conversations over the past couple of years has been really interesting.
Well, where are we going in Paul's life next week?
Yeah, so we talked about how we are called to follow and how we're called to go. We're going to be dealing with the reality that sometimes that's hard. That sometimes it is a struggle. And like I mentioned earlier in the podcast, like on the first missionary journey, Paul had trouble everywhere he went. There were people that did not believe in his message. There were people that caused him all kinds of problems. There are people that sought to kill him and thought they had succeeded. And like, I'm going to guess never to this degree, but sometimes faith is hard. Sometimes maintaining faithfulness is hard. Sometimes the things that we've been called and tasked by God to do are hard, and sometimes they're not going to go well. Mm-hmm. And so the question is, what does it mean to be called to struggle? How do we endure when we are struggling? I mean, really, to give away the sermon, the answer is, that we just cling even harder to Christ. That we hang on to the courage of our convictions that Jesus has called us to these things, and that matters. And so that we're going to be exploring just some of the struggles that Paul had, how he endured, and how God showed up in the midst of all of it.
Sounds great.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for joining us this week's podcast. Join us again next week on Sunday, online or in person, or at next week's podcast.
Thanks for listening to our Cut for Time conversation. Join us for worship in person or on Facebook Live Sundays at 10 o'clock Central Time. And now go in peace and serve the Lord.